Some golden oldies hit the NES. Well, oldies anyway. This week's pair of NES releases shares one thing in common with each other. They were both fairly elderly by the time they hit the NES. Spy Hunter originally appeared in arcades back in 1983, and Alpha Mission made its first appearance in Japan in arcades in 1985. We're starting to see a divide emerge here on NES as 1987 enters its final quarter, a division between cutting-edge new creations and more dated works. They can't all be Metroid or Punch-Out, sure, but the gulf between top and middle-tier NES software is considerably wider than it was on consoles of the previous generation. Of the two games featured this episode, it's hard to say which fares worse. Spy Hunter comes to us from SunSoft, a company that was still coming into its own at this point, though at least the company appears to have developed this conversion internally rather than licensing one of Namco's Japanese releases as they did with Sky Kid. So far as I can tell, SunSoft never released Spy Hunter in Japan. An extremely derivative work, Battle Formula, did show up on Famicom a few years later, only to be backported into the US as Super Spy Hunter. But this cartridge, it appears, was created by SunSoft specifically for the US market. One wonders why they made the effort. Spy Hunter was 4 years old by this point, and the only thing the NES conversion really had going for it was the fact that its timing as an arcade arrival meant that it had only previously appeared on one other console, the Atari 2600. So there's something to be said for its existence, even if the end result is pretty uninspiring. Unlike Capcom and Konami, who were beginning to take liberties with their arcade conversions, SunSoft's Spy Hunter is pretty much a direct adaptation. It loses a lot in translation. The Spy Hunter cabinet featured a proper driving simulation, complete with a steering wheel and pedal, and without those visceral interface elements, this port controls with a standard D-pad since the NES never received an official racing controller, much of the appeal is lost, especially since you use the D-pad to accelerate and steer at the same time. Yuck. At least the other primary feature of this game comes through more or less intact. The chiptune rendition of Henry Mancini's theme from Peter Gunn, booming from the cabinet speakers. Admittedly, Naoki Kodaka, who would later compose the brooding soundtracks to Batman the video game and Journey to Silius, was still coming into his own here, just like SunSoft itself. So there's a certain lack of power and kick-ass use of the NES's sampling channel here. But he makes up for it by serving up one of the NES's first example of the incestuous relationship between game music and progressive rock. The extended composition that plays beneath the action busts out into several different swirling waveform arpeggios that appear inspired by the lively keyboard solos in Emerson, Lake & Palmer's cover of the Peter Gunn theme. Hell yeah. Sadly, that's more or less the highlight of this port. Spy Hunter consists of vehicular combat along a singular road that branches out in different directions, and depending on which branch you take, you'll see somewhat different terrain each time. It's all kind of the same though, and you see all the different enemies in the first zone or two. The only real change-up arrives after a couple of minutes into gameplay, when you reach the water and your car does a Roger Moore-era James Bond thing and transforms into a speedboat. Thankfully, there are no pigeons doing double takes. Further down the road, you also end up on slippery, iced-over streets, which are doubly dangerous due to the fact that the helicopters that like to harass you blend into the icy road and become much more difficult to see. In retaining its arcade mechanics, Spy Hunter ends up being an NES game in which play sessions typically last just a few minutes. The golden ideal for most arcade operators was for coin-op titles to coax a quarter out of players every 3 minutes, and Spy Hunter's design is nothing if not naked in its cupidity. Players begin the game with a timer that quickly runs down as they race, eventually trailing out to zero. While the timer runs, players have effectively infinite lives. However, they actually have a stock of 3 cars, and every wreck or spin-out removes 1 car from their reserve. When you crash once the timer has hit 0, you can play your next car until you run out of cars, at which point it's game over. It's pretty cutthroat, and SunSoft elected to retain that mechanic here, even though players obviously don't need to sink quarters into their NES to play. The speed and ferocity of Spy Hunter's action makes it a pretty tough game, So you'll have to forgive me for using an infinite life cheat to see the more advanced zones of the road. I am but a mortal man. Spy Hunter takes cues from the car combat scenes of James Bond flicks, putting players behind the wheel of a tricked out sports car sporting infinite machine gun ammo and a number of optional bonus weapons. There also appears to be some Knight Rider influence here, which should come as a little surprise given that the TV series debuted 1 year before Spy Hunter showed up in arcades. You begin this game by having your roadster dispatched along the side of the highway by a semi, which then zooms off. Every once in a while, a similar big rig will appear with its trailer open, allowing you to line up your car and pull inside. Take advantage of the opportunity and you'll upgrade your car with a limited loadout of secondary weapons, ranging from missiles to smokescreens to oil slicks. Really, the benefit to all these upgrades is that they can wipe otherwise indestructible enemy cars and helicopters and boats off the road. Only a handful of enemy vehicles, all depicted in black, can be blasted with your default weapons. You're actually more likely to destroy friendly vehicles with your fire, which temporarily arrests your scoring and prevents you from racking up points towards a 1-up. Indestructible cars can be destroyed by running them off the road, though they aren't shy about reciprocating. And some enemy cars have hubcaps that extend as tire-skewering blades that'll wreck your day and your ride. And that's pretty much all there is to Spy Hunter. It's a fast and punishing arcade conversion that doesn't offer anything new on NES besides its accessibility. Super Spy Hunter would arrive a few years later and be far more satisfying, and the one other entry in the franchise, 2001's Spy Hunter Nowhere to Run, is mainly notable for featuring the likeness of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as a tie-in to a movie that ended up never being made. It's not the greatest legacy, but hey, at least the music is great. Similarly uninspiring is Alpha Mission. It's another SNK arcade conversion, so perhaps that should be expected. Alpha Mission, which appeared in Japan with the amazing title of ASO Armored Scrum Object, feels like a half-hearted attempt to bite off Xevious, combined with Tekkon and Hudson's Star Force. We'll see both of these down the road on NES Works, and the latter would eventually mutate into the legendary Star Soldier franchise. And as in Star Force, you control a tiny ship flying past lengthy space fortresses, weaving through waves of enemies, blowing up both aerial and ground-based objects in order to reveal power-ups depicted as letter icons. As in Xevious, you need to use two different forms of attack, one to destroy aerial foes, and the other to take out ground-based enemies. The vertical shooter was all the rage in the mid-80s thanks to Xevious, and Alpha Mission toes the line between that game and Star Force. Your cannons, fired with the B button, can take out airborne foes, while you have a torpedo set to the A button that smashes surface-based targets. The surface targets generally consist of gun emplacements and panels that reveal power-ups when struck. These include alternative weapons, speed-ups, and energy boosts to power your secondary attack forms. There are also backward, black-rimmed icons that set you back, an E that drains weapon power, a K that reduces your power to its basic level, a C that removes your speed upgrades, and worst of all, an R that sets you back half the stage. There's not a lot to be excited about here. Enemies of indeterminate shape swirl around in dizzying patterns, lacking the sort of orderly logic and progression of something like 1942. To add to the frustration, many enemies, including bosses, give no tells when they're hit by your attacks, not even sound effects, which turns these encounters into a mysterious slog. Even worse, every time you die, you're flung back to the beginning of the current stage, which is unusually punitive in a game with one-hit kills. This is game design as a formless blob, bereft of personality or style. While the usual sources don't cite Micronix as having had hands on this port, everything about Alpha Mission screams Micronix. It's ugly, sloppy, and joyless. So if this wasn't a Micronix port, it was SNK's internal teams doing their best to live down to that standard. Bad music, dull gameplay, questionable visuals. Is there anything good to say about Alpha Mission? Well, some of the secondary weapons are kinda neat, and there's a sort of in-game menu screen available that allows you to pause the action and choose between different sub-weapons by flying over your selection. And some of the backgrounds are kinda stylish, I guess? That's about it though. Unfortunately for Alpha Mission, it arrived shortly after the mundane but perfectly playable Micronix version of Tiger Heli, and simultaneously with the brilliant Zanuck. As with Ring King, it's hard to get excited about such a towering achievement in mediocrity when there's a vastly superior take on the same genre just around the corner. If, for some bizarre reason, you need to play Alpha Mission, do yourself a favor and grab the Arcade Archives or SNK 40th Anniversary Collection version and enjoy the arcade version, which is essentially the same thing but sounds, plays, and looks much better. Next time on NES Works, Compile shows you hacks how to really make an NES game.